Hello everyone, and welcome back to my channel. I am Amanda, an amateur writer and word enthusiast. This is my second video in my series Good Lines Micro Appreciation, and this time dealing with Dune Messiah, the sequel to Dune by Frank Herbert. We are about to dive into the story and a bunch of examples from it, but there are a few points I would like to discuss first, though you can skip ahead if you want. If you haven't seen my video on Dune, you can definitely go check that one out. I'll be making a playlist and everything. But if you have read the first Dune book, you should be alright for this one. I would like to thank everyone who had nice things to say about my first video, however much of it they watched. I understand that it's a niche audience that would enjoy this content. It did mean a lot to me to come home the day after I posted my video and to see that my first ever comment was encouraging of what I would like to achieve on this channel. I was prepared for no one clicking on it, and my dad was worried I'd get something nasty. So getting an encouraging nod was really special to me, so thank you. I'm also taking the advice to split my content into more videos. So this is part 1 of 2 on Dune Messiah. I literally split my script in half. I went with a really long first video because whenever I watch YouTube, I never think of the length of any video I'm watching, whether I'll have time to finish it, because I know that YouTube remembers where I left off whenever I close it, so it just pops back up again whenever I start my computer. But I understand, I'm willing to accept that I'm the odd one out in that case. I often am. I did say in a pinned comment that I would address the Appendices issue, which was cool to pin a comment as a YouTuber. To iterate, I don't like appendices in fiction. I do think it's a generally accepted rule of good writing that you should try not to information dump on your audience, and an appendix feels to me like an unabashed information dump. Like, here are all the things I wish you knew that I couldn't fit into the text. If the information is important, it should be in the main body, I think. Now, I did feel a bit silly for skipping reading the appendices until after I'd filmed the video, because they're not bad, not at all. And it does give some extraneous information, but it's not offensive. The first appendix is the most relevant, I think, because it contradicts information given in the text. It explains how it was actually Liet Kynes' father who came up with the whole plan to terraform Arrakis, which is, to my recollection, only hinted at in the chapter of Kynes' death. Jessica wrongly gives credit to the plan to Liet Kynes more than once. It was interesting because, apparently, the planet was pretty much barren before Kynes' father introduced off-world plant and animal life. Aside for the sandworms, of course. More interesting, it describes the life cycle of a sandworm, which it turns out we need to know for the second book, because to have spice you need more than just a desert and a sandworm. The second appendix, which is supposed to address the religion of the Fremen, actually describes how religions evolved with the establishment of space travel. It is very interesting, but I would much rather have seen it in the main text. Herbert is so good at dropping clues throughout the story that it's a shame that he didn't do it with this as well. The Earth origin is confirmed, which, unfortunately for me, creates other problems, one of them being with the Bene Gesserit. The appendix calls them sorceresses, as though that's a natural thing to exist, but with Earth origin confirmed, I want a better explanation for their existence. Otherwise, I find it interesting that the Orange Catholic Bible was created by committee to distill all major religions into one, and were continued despite universe-wide riots. Unfortunately, I feel that the confirmed real-world origin of these societies does poke at the white savior problems as well. If there's an attempt at authenticity by study of a culture which Frank Herbert didn't belong to, then there are more intricacies. Would he be able to depict it accurately and respectfully, or does this book come with a large dose of exotification and/or appropriation? If, as I thought when I read the first book, there were only vague traces of cultures that existed tens of millennia ago, then Herbert could get away with more, rather than if he attempted to be accurate. Again, though, I'm not educated on it, and I wouldn't be able to tell you which parts he gets right or wrong. I can only deal with it the same way I have, as though the distinct cultures in the book are inventions of Herbert, though I'm beginning to doubt that quite a bit. It does remain uncomfortable, but there can be uncomfortable aspects of a thing without it rendering us incapable of enjoying that thing. If it makes you really uncomfortable or angry or sad, you can ignore the whole thing. I have discarded books when I get a too uncomfortable feeling from them for one reason or other. Or maybe that's a cue to take a closer look at it, to confront those feelings. But that isn't the video for that. That sort of thing should be written by someone who is educated. I'll still tell you what I think when we get to those parts, but these are all my thoughts based on my feelings. I would love to know what you think about them, though, so fire off in the comments. I did say in my last video that the Fremen didn't need to be saved from themselves, but it turned out that they did once upon a time, and it was done in a remarkably white savior kind of way. The third appendix describes how the Bene Gesserit failed, that the Reverend Mother should have understood that Paul survived to become the religious leader of the Fremen, that he was the Kwisatz Haderach, and I find this appendix completely superfluous. We all gathered that just from reading the book. Then there is a registry of characters, and last, a glossary. And the glossary is the part that made me feel a bit silly, because it would have answered a lot of questions for me. For one, I wouldn't have had to go to the wiki. And I know that I got a few things wrong, but I also got some things right. The glossary is, by all means, handy and informative, but reading it feels somewhat like when you get a clue when you're playing a puzzle game. That I would much rather have figured it out on my own, and I feel a hint cheated when I realize that I couldn't have figured it out on my own because there is not enough information in the text itself. I'm still going to use Merriam-Webster throughout this because their definitions means a lot more for my betterment in English. If I ever become a published author, I'm sure I might end up in a position to eat my words on appendices. They do have a practical function after all, demonstratively. As I read the glossary, it seemed to me that it contained terms which hadn't come up, which led me to suspect that I was meant to keep the first book on hand while reading the coming books, and that would annoy me to no tomorrow, because it's annoying. The wiki would be more accessible at that point. Since I read the appendices, I also read the foreword for Dune Messiah, written by Frank Herbert, Frank's son, who picked up his mantle. I usually avoid reading forewords and afterwards because as a reader, I believe in death of the author to a very large extent. I think it's the experience of the reader is supreme. But I was interested reading the foreword because it tells us how many were disappointed with this second book when it was first published, because it breaks from the pattern of Paul's magnificence in the first. They didn't realize that Dune Messiah was always meant to be like a bridge to the third book. This spoke to me on such a profound level. I have a couple of major creative projects in my life. For one of them, I've never been able to write the second book to completion because it is, to me, rather uninteresting. I still like it, and it's important, and all of the things that happen in it are important because they are needed for the third book when the story really kicks off again. So I sympathize. Also, The foreword mentions that Frank Herbert was influenced by the sentiment of his readers, because apparently there was an uproar that two of their favorite characters died, being Liet Kynes and Duncan Idaho. Because of this, Herbert was influenced to bring back Duncan Idaho as a Gola, which seems obviously based on the myths around a golem. And I have mixed feelings about that. Part of me thinks that a writer should have enough creative integrity not to yield to audience pressure. But I also understand the desire to do so. It is something I might have to eat my words on as well. My feelings about it are even more mixed because I expected to hate the Gola character, but I do like him, so I don't feel that Herbert compromised very much. I do feel that my reading of the first book was completely different from all those complaining that Paul is a disappointment here. It was pretty obvious to me that for Paul to remain a viable character, he would have to be brought down after his meteoric rise. And I think one of the words I used the most was variations on the word tragic. When the hallucination of Kynes' father warns of the dangers of a hero, capital H, something that is repeated in the Appendices, I kept thinking of the saying, "Show me a hero and I'll write you a tragedy." Other than that, I didn't have any expectations going into this. I never saw the sequel to the 2000 miniseries, Children of Dune. I also believe it's completely valid to stop consuming any IP you really enjoy, because the longer you partake in something, the higher the chance that it will go to utter garbage before long. It's fine to quit while you're ahead. There are some inconsistencies between the first and second book, but not to an offensive degree. Your plans for your stories evolve with time, after all. It also suffers from the thing that often happens with sequels. In order to maintain tension, the stakes are raised, but those raised stakes effectively undercut the tension in previous installments. This sort of thing, it doesn't bother me though. It's not a barrier for me to keep appreciating Dune in isolation. I had some thoughts about what might have happened during those few years between book 1 and 2, such as, and I don't think this is true, it seems that Herbert learned the word oracle and thought it was perfect for a name for the Prescient's abilities. I don't remember seeing it in the first book, but it's all over the second. Second, prescience seems a lot more common than in the first book, but I guess that could have been triggered somehow, as 12 in-book years have passed. However, one of the major premises of Dune Messiah is that anyone with prescience is hidden from the prescient vision of other oracles. I don't know if this holds true for the first book. When Paul first drinks the unchanged water of life, he is able to see the best Spacing Guild navigators searching for him. But it's not an outright contradiction because we're not giving any details on what vision he saw to lead him to that conclusion. I do still think that Herbert came up with this for the second book, or at least decided to make a much bigger deal out of it because it is central. And I understand it's good because as Paul's prescience gets more accurate, it needs bigger weaknesses not to be boringly overpowered. Something I would have liked seeing some attention to is the Spacing Guild's big secret being out. They are consistently disrespected in both books, but I made a big deal out of their dependence on spice being secret at first and then revealed toward the end of the book. I would have liked to see some discussion on what effect that had on the guild. One of the main characters is a navigator, munching on spice most of the time, without any acknowledgement that he was a top-class secret in the first book. Minor inconsistencies I noticed is that the J word I was nervous about in the last video is in this book capitalized, while the words mentat and Kwisatz Haderach no longer are. Also, in this book, whenever a made-up word is first mentioned, it's in italics. It's all fine, but I wonder at the inconsistencies in formatting. The reason I was worried about that word is because it's on the Nerd City list of prohibited words, and I have chosen, just in case, to replace it with the word Jason. I chose it because thinking about Jason Stackhouse gives me a giggle. If an early season Jason Stackhouse was unleashed on the universe, his activities would certainly be censurable. It also feels well to replace it with a name, since it is, in this book, capitalized. It was a toss-up between Jason Stackhouse of True Blood and John of Homelander notoriety from The Boys. But though he is a fantastic character, but he's less fun than screwed up terrifying. Anyway. Despite 12 years passing, Paul is a consistent character. Already at 15, he had a tendency to keep secrets, trying to deal with his prescient dread on his own. And he continues to do so. He only tells people his plans when he deems it necessary, which is arguably to his detriment. I would call that a character flaw, his biggest one. I really like it as a character flaw because there is a layer of condescension to it. Like, no one but he can be trusted with the information because they can't see the full picture. It might be true, it might not be, so Paul is still a benign character. He's also staying morally consistent. The Jason is happening, despite what he wanted. Even though he didn't want it, he doesn't disavow responsibility for it. And I was surprised that Paul gave up on stopping the Jason, but it doesn't change my feelings about Dune, the first book. It was already a tragedy to me, so that's just another layer of it. And just as in Dune, this book is started by the reader being informed of a conspiracy, though this one is extended throughout the whole book, with a nice surprising twist at the end. There is a consistent mystery about how far Paul's powers actually reach. And all of the chapters, they are still not numbered, but they are still introduced by a quote from a significant historical source, but not all of them from Irulon's documentation, which is kind of sad, I think. And that's all the points I had to discuss before diving into the book. So let's get to it. Chapter 1. The book begins with what I have named a prologue, which is a transcript of an interview between a priest of Muad'Dib and one of Paul's cynics, a historian who has been imprisoned for his public opinions. The historian is about to be executed for heresy, but his description of events coincide with what we learned in the first book. The conversation thus serves to recap the first book and to show that Paul's priesthood does things in his name without his approval. The first chapter is very short, and it is an example of writing from that arrested historian, establishing Paul's character as it is after the 12 years in-universe time skip. It iterates that his monopoly on spice gives him control over all those who depend on it, namely the Bene Gesserit, the Spacing Guild, and all the normal individuals who are addicted to it. He himself is dependent upon it for his prescience. The chapter also tells us that there is a conspiracy formed by the Bene Gesserit, the Spacing Guild, and the new class of this book, the Bene Tleilax, along with people in Paul's proximity. Also, a top priest of Paul's cult, Korba the Panegyrist, apparently wants to make a martyr out of Paul Muad'Dib via the hand of Chani, which just sounds ridiculous. Chani would never hurt Paul. Panegyrist was a new word for me, which means someone who delivers a eulogy. So we learn of the conspiracy from the get. The historian also establishes the questionable usefulness of prescience, that it hampers rather than helps the agency of the prophet. Of course, he contained the ingredients of history, ideal and idealized. Really nice use of ingredients, and nice contrast between ideal and idealized. He brought the Spacing Guild to its knees and placed his own sister, Alia, on the religious throne the Bene Gesserit had thought their own. Alia is the best reason for the time skip for me because she is much more interesting as a teenager rather than a small child. Her problems as a small child, with countless adult memories, were well played out in the first book, so I prefer her with new problems. Muad'Dib's Kissarit missionaries carried the religious war across space in a Jason whose major impetus endured only 12 standard years, but in that time, religious colonialism brought all but a fraction of the human universe under one rule. Nice use of impetus and endured, and a nice summary of the time skip. Other histories say Muad'Dib was defeated by obvious plotters, the Guild, the Sisterhood, and the scientific amoralist of the Bene Tleilax with their face dancer disguises. The Bene Tleilax is the factor whose existence alters the tension of the first book. I'm also frustrated I have to stumble over that word over and over in the script. But I do like the description of amoral scientists. Chapter 2, in which we learn of the plans of the conspiracy between the Bene Gesserit Reverend Mother Gaius Helen Mahayam, a Spacing Guild navigator called Edric, and the Bene Tleilax Scytale. They are attempting to recruit Princess Irulan into the plot. Nobody likes the navigator. He is seemingly only involved as a precautionary measure against Paul's prescience, because all navigators requires some measure of prescience. It is really amusing that still nobody likes the guild. I also really like the Bene prefix for the different orders. This chapter also establishes the basics of one of the main characters, Scytale, who is a face dancer, which is someone who can completely adopt the appearance and voice of someone else. He is also the obvious master manipulator within the group. The BT have the ability to create golas out of dead people, as long as they are preserved close to death. They have made one of Duncan Idaho, now named Hate, to present to Paul as a gift, a part of the plot against him. And they have also made him into a mentat and philosopher. Scytale dismisses any risk that Hate might tell Paul too much of the truth. Apparently, no matter what Hate says, there is no danger to the conspiracy. Despite the murderous nature of the plot he hoped to devise, the thoughts of Scytale, the Tleilaxu face dancer, returned again and again to rueful compassion. Nice use of rueful compassion. It is also, apparently, part of the BT ethos that when they hunt a prey, they must present some avenue of escape for them, which is sort of meh for me. It sounds like an arbitrary way to excuse amoral acts. He kept this benignity carefully hidden from his fellow conspirators. Such feelings told him, though, that he found it easier to identify with the victim than with the attackers, a thing characteristic of the Tleilaxu. This makes me wonder why. Do they feel like victims of some kind? The argument about psychic poison had been going on for some time now. It was energetic and vehement, but polite in that blindly compulsive way adepts of the great schools always adopted for matters close to their dogma. I like this illustration, that these different orders have evolved and specialized for so long that it hampers them when they are to cooperate. She was a black-robed stick figure, a witch crone seated in a floater chair at Scytale's left. Her Abba hood had been thrown back to expose a leathery face beneath silver hair. Deeply pocketed eyes stared out of the skull mask features. Gaius Helen Mohayam is always given such great descriptions. They were using a Mirbasa language, honed phalange consonants and joined vowels. It was an instrument for conveying fine emotional subtleties. Edric, the guild steersman, replied to the Reverend Mother now with a vocal courtesy contained in a sneer, a lovely touch of disdainful politeness. I really appreciate that these multilingual people use one good for their immediate needs. Also, I like that the text is still in English. It is very impressive to make up your own language, but I still find it annoying when faced with too much of it as a reader. Edric swam in a container of orange gas only a few paces away. His container sat in the center of the transparent dome which the Bene Gesserit had built for this meeting. The guildsman was an elongated figure, vaguely humanoid with finned feet and hugely fanned membranous hands, a fish in a strange sea. As I said in the intro, I would have liked something about how seeing a navigator was forbidden until Paul forced them into the open. Saitel's mind turned from nuances of language and faces to nuances of location. All around the dome lay hills mangy with melting snow, which reflected mottled wet blueness from the small blue-white sun hanging at the meridian. A very nice description, in particular the use of mangy with melting snow. The Reverend Mother drew back, and Saitel saw her reassessing him. They were all products of the profound prana bindu training, capable of muscle and nerve control that few humans ever achieved. But Saitel, a face dancer, had muscles and nerve linkages the others didn't even possess, plus a special quality of simpatico, a mimic's insight with which he could put on the psyche of another as well as the other's appearance. This raises the question on how it's possible for a human to be that different physiologically. We make assumptions later, as it isn't explained here. Saitel gave her enough time to complete the reassessment, said, "Poison." He uttered the word with the atonals, which said he alone understood its secret meaning. Nice use of atonals, though Merriam-Webster says that atonal isn't a noun. Eyes closed, the Reverend Mother nodded. The phenomenon of prescience is poorly understood even by its initiates, she said. If it were not so, this book would be a lot shorter. The Bene Gesserit, of course, had briefed their princess, primed her with a lie adroit, but the moment always came when a Bene Gesserit must trust her own training and instincts. Nice use of lie adroit, and nice foreshadowing of Irulan's character. She gives him no air, Irulan said, her voice measuring out controlled calmness, because I am secretly administering a contraceptive. Is that the sort of admission you wanted from me? I was very sympathetic to Irulan at the end of the first book, and that sympathy is effectively undercut here. What an effing witch, am I right? Also, nice use of measuring. No, let us assume that our wise Sardaukar commander had Idaho's corpse preserved for the axolotl tanks. Why not? This corpse held the flesh and nerves of one of the finest swordsmen in history, an advisor to the Atreides, a military genius. What a waste to lose all that training and ability when it might be revived as an instructor for the Sardaukar. An axolotl is one of these amphibians living in that one lake in Mexico. And I think it's an excellent choice for the tanks used to house the genetic creations. I don't know what I feel about the Aztec-sounding names for this order. I guess I'm fine with the flavor, but I would like an explanation. How did you overcome your Kwisatz Haderach? Irulan asked. A creature who has spent his life creating one particular representation of his selfdom will die rather than become the antithesis of that representation, Saitel said. Yes, the BT are overpowered enough to have created their own Kwisatz Haderach. It, apparently, ended its life when it could not actualize its self-image. I don't really understand what that means, and it feels like I'm supposed to after finishing the book, but I still don't, I'm afraid. I sort of understand it, but I feel like there's a threshold there that I'm not passing. The guildsman drew back into his tank in flailing agitation. Everybody hates the guild, still, a nice use of flailing agitation. You are devious, Saitel, Irulan said. How devious, she must not guess, Saitel thought. When this is done, we will possess a Kwisatz Haderach we can control. These others will possess nothing. I would want to know why the BT didn't try again to create a Kwisatz Haderach. They are amoral scientists, after all. Should they not be confident that they can recreate the experiment until they are successful? Going after Paul should be second best to making their own. It is also nice to know that the BT planned to screw everyone over in the end. The old Baron Harkonnen, our Emperor's grandfather, was he a Tleilaxi creation? Irulan asked. Not one of ours, Saitel said. But then nature often produces creations as deadly as ours. We merely produce them under conditions where we can study them. It is interesting to have the antagonist of the first book being presented as the epitome of evil here. I agree that he was evil, but I don't know if I would choose him as the prime example. Having underage slaves is up there on the scale, but beside it, he was to me quite banal. Well, he did make Fade kill all of his enslaved sex partners with his bare hands, so yeah, maybe Irulan is onto something here. Scythiel smiled, passing a benign gaze over his companions. They were as he'd been led to expect. The old Reverend Mother wielded her emotions like a scythe. Irulan had been well trained for a task at which she had failed, a flawed Bene Gesserit creation. Edric was no more and no less than the magician's hand. He might conceal and distract. This does a nice job of setting Scythiel in the role of antagonist, the primary opposition. Hate is a multi-purpose Gola, Scythiel said. The Emperor's sister is of an age when she can be distracted by a charming male designed for that purpose. She will be attracted by his maleness and by his abilities as a mentat. This chapter makes an excellent job of setting up an air of discomfort around Hate. You're always prepared for something going wrong around him, both with Paul and Alia. I was concerned that Alia would be presented as a weak-minded, hormone-driven teenager, but my worries were unwarranted. A mentat, Mohayam muttered. Scythiel glanced at the old Reverend Mother, seeing the ancient hates which colored her responses. From the days of the Butlerian Jason, when thinking machines had been wiped from most of the universe, computers had inspired distrust. Old emotions colored the human computer as well. In the previous book, the Bene Gesserit were held up to be like the highest magical order, enlightened or whatever, but they are also undercut here by the existence of the BT. It's also interesting that thinking machines have been wiped from most of the universe. The Fremen are civil, educated and ignorant, Scythiel said. They're not mad. They're trained to believe, not to know. Belief can be manipulated. Only knowledge is dangerous. I hadn't thought of this before, but the Fremen were primed to believe on the slightest of cues. And before Paul, they believed in Liatkains's father's plans for Arrakis. And Paul, keeping secrets, maintains the mystery around him. It discourages anyone from being moved beyond belief. As she spoke, Scythiel recognized what the Bene Gesserit had arrayed here for him, a beautiful and intelligent female who could never be his. Ah, well, he thought, perhaps I'll copy her for another. It would inspire you to disconnect with the real world if you were able to arbitrarily create copies of whichever person you want. And it would lead to an entitlement to play with other people however you wish. Chapter 3. Paul has returned from a nighttime walk through Arrakeen without his guards or whatever because he likes to pretend he's someone else. Paul's and Chani's relationship is established as he returns. She is one of his most valuable advisors, extremely knowledgeable about statecraft and political relationships. They fall into an almost argument because Chani suggests to Paul that he should impregnate Irulan to secure his line, because Chani has not conceived a child. It would also be strategic to isolate Irulan from anyone who conspire against Paul, since they would question her loyalty, which is true. It seems Paul hasn't seen a future where Chani gives him an heir, which seems contradictory. He seems pretty confident in the first book that there will be other children besides their murdered firstborn. Again, it's vague enough not to be an outright contradiction, but Paul's powers were less specific then. There is a flashback scene with Irulan earlier in the day, and we learn that Hera ended up married to Stilgar, and I'm glad she wasn't killed when Leto II was. Irulan demands to be given a child, and threatens that if Paul doesn't oblige, she'll turn to another man and claim that it's Paul's anyway. Paul doesn't oppose her being unfaithful, but will not tolerate any child but his own on the throne. Irulan seems to take this as the last push to join the conspiracy against him, like she can justify it by giving Paul a chance to do what she wants, presenting an avenue of escape, as it were. Paul is obviously distraught by thoughts of the Jason and feels powerless to break out of the expectations built of him by the priesthood around him. He also perceives a terrible, terrible future he wants to avoid, staying on theme with the first book, but this one isn't spelled out as the Jason was. He tossed the boots into the corner beneath the room's lone glow globe, attacked the seal strips of his still suits. Nice use of attacked. Gods below, how tired he was. The tiredness stopped at his muscles, though, and left his mind seething. Nice use of seething, and I think we've all been there, trying to exhaust ourselves and only exceeding halfway. Most of that nameless flowing life outside the walls of his keep couldn't be shared by an emperor, but to walk down a public street without attracting attention, what a privilege. To pass by the clamoring of mendicant pilgrims, to hear a Fremen curse of shopkeeper, "You have damp hands." Nice use of mendicant, one word that has at some point been stricken from my vocab training list because I learned it. Would it be fun to go through my vocab training? My list is huge, FYI. It would feel like extremely nerdy content, for word nerds such as myself, that is. Maybe it'll attract word nerds to the channel and we can have fun together. It would be more bite-sized videos. More than a disguise, the suit made him a stranger to his city self. In the still suit, he abandoned security and put on the old skills of violence. Pilgrims and townfolk passed him then with eyes downcast. They left the wild ones strictly alone out of prudence. If the desert had a face for city folk, it was a Fremen face concealed by a still suit's mouth-nose filters. I'd say that this is the first obvious othering of the Fremen which goes on throughout this book, and it is unfortunate. My feelings about it changed a hint by the end, and I'll address that when we get there. A swish of door hangings and a wash of light broke his reverie. I quite hammered the point in the last video that Herbert had a habit of unnecessarily putting an ing at the end of nouns, but that seems to be gone now, or else it would have been a swishing of door hangings. I wouldn't use the ing, but they were fun and quirky, and I miss them now. I tried to be on the lookout for them throughout my reading, but I kept forgetting. Cheney entered bearing his coffee service on a platinum tray. 2 slaved glow globes followed her, darting to their positions, one at the head of their bed, one hovering beside her to light her work. Nice use of slaved, and interesting functionality of glow globes. Cheney moved with an ageless air of fragile power, so self-contained, so vulnerable. I do like seeing strong female characters having feminine sides without it being a weakness. Cheney is an independent-minded Fremen, but she's not always in your face about it. The pot, fluting silver female shape, pregnant, had come to him as a ganima, a spoil of battle won when he'd slain the former owner in single combat. I understand why we're being reminded about this Fremen word, and I lavished praise on it in the last video for its wonderful specificity. But the specificity is undermined here. It was supposed to have the overtone of being a spoils of battle that is no longer used for its original purpose. The coffee pot is still used as a coffee pot. His angry denial was drowned in the whistling scream of a spice lighter hurling itself spaceward from the field outside Arrakeen. Very nice description of sci-fi ambient noise. So that was it. Cheney had not produced a child for him. Someone else then must do it. Why not Irulan? That was the way Cheney's mind worked, and it must be done in an act of love because all the Empire avowed strong taboos against artificial ways. Cheney had come to a Fremen decision. Cheney's suggestion is underscored by the fact that Fremen women are accustomed to sharing their men, not always amiably. But Cheney was still upset when Paul said that he would marry Irulan, but that can be explained by her already being upset by the loss of her child, not wanting to lose Paul as well. He closed his eyes, and Cheney came into the memories as a girl once more, veiled in springtime, singing, waking from sleep beside him, so perfect that the very vision of her consumed him. In his memory she smiled, shyly at first, then strained against the vision as though she longed to escape. Excellent foreshadowing. Paul's mouth went dry. For a moment, his nostrils tasted the smoke of a devastated future and the voice of another kind of vision commanding him to disengage, disengage, disengage. His prophetic visions had been eavesdropping on eternity for such a long while, catching snatches of foreign tongues, listening to stones and to flesh not his own. Since the day of his first encounter with terrible purpose, he had peered at the future, hoping to find peace. This iterated encouragement to disengage is repeated throughout the book, and I don't really understand it. Like, I don't understand what alternative course of action he could take. It does emphasize that he has reasons to be tired. All he wanted was to avoid this future, and it doesn't get any better from here. Irulan wore a robe of grey whale fur. She pulled it close, touched a hand to her hair. He could see her wondering at his mild tone. The angry words she'd obviously prepared for this meeting could be sensed, leaving her mind in a welter of second thoughts. Who hasn't been there, too? Working yourself up for an argument and having your anger undermined by a conciliatory tone. So annoying. Irulan grew very still, and Paul became aware that she had locked herself into a vice-like control. A heavy burden indeed, he thought, and he wondered why prescient visions had given him no glimpse of this possible future. I do struggle with the portrayal of Paul's abilities throughout the book. Paul has had the unchanged water of life for 12 years now, so I feel like he should know very well why some future would be hidden from him. Should he not be assuming that Irulan, who has been away on a trip, that she has been influenced by someone else with oracular powers? When I think more about this, it seems even less likely that he would have been able to know that the Spacing Guild was searching for him in the first book. If even the effects of interacting with the Navigator is hidden from Paul, then how did he know? That's a real princess down the hall. She was raised in all the nasty intrigues of an imperial court. Plotting is as natural to her as writing her stupid histories. Paul is not impressed by Irulan's praise of him in writing. Fascinating. She lay down beside him, placed her head against his neck. They have come to a decision on how to fight you, she said. Irulan reeks of secret decisions. I do really like Cheney as a character. She's obviously clever and has great intuition, and it's interesting to take into account that the Tao that is enhanced by common spice consumption of a people allows for the subconscious sharing of thoughts. Cheney is the one closest to Paul and does share in his prescience at times. Terrible purpose brushed him. It was a Coriolis wind in his soul. It whistled through the framework of his being. His body knew things then never learned in consciousness. It's a nice throwback to Paul's experience of terrible purpose that it extends beyond the Jason. I'm a figurehead. When Godhead's given, that's the one thing the so-called God no longer controls. A bitter laugh shook him. He sensed the future looking back at him out of dynasties not even dreamed. He felt his being cast out, crying, unchained from the rings of fate. Only his name continued. I like the emphasis on the personal effect on failing to stop the Jason. It was his whole purpose in the first book, and failing has now locked him into his current position. Siege. The ancient Shakobsa word absorbed him, a place of retreat and safety in a time of peril. Cheney's suggestion made him long for vistas of open sand, for clean distances where one could see an enemy coming from a long way off. Nice way to show that there are limits to his prescience. Even though he sees the future, it has only created grander dangers for him. It would be a relief to deal with whatever enemy is readily seen to him, rather than all these shadowed ones. He thought then of the Jason, of the gene mingling across parsecs, and the vision told him how he might end it. Should he pay the price? All the hatefulness would evaporate, dying as fires die, ember by ember. But oh, the terrifying price. I'm still confused about this alternative. Even after reading the end, I wonder how. He keeps saying that even without him, the Jason would carry on in his name. So how can he end it? The only thing I can see would be his godliness being completely undermined to the point of discrediting the religious feelings around him. But there are so many invested in keeping it going, so I don't know. I've loitered, he thought, and he saw how he'd been hemmed in by boundaries of love and the Jason. And what was one life, no matter how beloved, against all the lives the Jason was certain to take? Could single misery be weighed against the agony of multitudes? This book, feeling so much like a sequel with raised stakes, made me unconsciously try to think of something that would be worse than the big bad in the first book. But it's difficult to come up with something worse than a universe-wide war. In that moment, his whole life was a limb shaken by the departure of a bird, and the bird was chance, free will. The story becomes even more tragic if free will was at some point available to him. I remember one suggestion that it might have been before his mythos was cemented by the death of Jamis. I still haven't noted a presented alternative, a way for him to have wriggled out of it besides everyone present dying. Which doesn't count. Could it be, he wondered, that the Oracle didn't tell the future? Could it be that the Oracle made the future? Had he exposed his life to some web of underlying threads, trapped himself there in that long-ago awakening, victim of a spider future which even now advanced upon him with terrifying jaws? This is one of the central conflicts of the book. Paul does see countless possible futures, and he chooses a course of action which does hold an element of free will, but Paul obviously doesn't feel like he has it. A Bene Gesserit axiom slipped into his mind. To use raw power is to make yourself infinitely vulnerable to greater powers. Nice use of slipped, and when you have a big stick, there's always the risk of someone else having an even bigger stick. I know it angers you, Cheney said, touching his arm. It's true that the tribes have revived the old rites and the blood sacrifices, but I took no part in those. Oh, really? Old rites, you say? Blood sacrifices, eh? What kind of blood sacrifices, Cheney? Even though she doesn't condone them, whatever they obviously don't outrage her. Paul inhaled a deep, trembling breath. The torrent of his vision dissipated, became a deep, still place whose currents moved with an absorbing power beyond his reach. It does seem as a tremendous effort whenever he tries to change what he sees as obviously overpowering influences. Chapter 4. In a way, it is one of the best chapters, even though it is profoundly frustrating, with two immensely uncomfortable implications. It does reinforce that the voice of the narrator is the same as in the first book, the narrator delivering no judgment whatsoever. Sightale is an Arrakeen, recruiting a Fremen for the conspiracy, or, as it turns out, acquiring an angle of infiltration. The Fremen man is Farak, who had one line I remember in the first book, a member of Paul's unit in Siege Tabar. He wasn't sold on the Jason, but participated anyway and became rich because of it. However, he longs for the good old days in the desert and blames all of the changes on Paul. It is very impressive that Paul manages to portray Farak as such an unlikable character without specifically pointing out the hypocrisy and flaws in reasoning. The same goes for his son, who is a literal piece of dirt, that I'm not at all sad that they are both killed by the end of the chapter. The hypocrisy isn't that he blames Paul for the Jason, since Paul kept all of his thoughts about it to himself, but it's in the romanticization of the old ways. A defining quality of Fremen culture at the time was a reverence for water. It held a cathedral presence for them, and yet Farak shows utter disregard for it now. He is as decadent as everyone around him. In the end, Sightale's objective is to abduct a Fremen woman currently in the house with the father and son. After learning all of the gathered information about Paul's fortress and the names of all of the Fremen involved in the conspiracy. The advent of the field process shield and the lace gun with their explosive interaction, deadly to the attacker and attacked, place the current determinatives on weapons technology. This is part of the intro quote, lifted from a speech of Paul to the War College. We already knew that it's shield that made close combat relevant again. It is interesting that the development mirrors the limits placed on computers, but the ban on AI is imposed by religion and culture rather than science. The old man stood in his doorway, peering out with blue eyes. The eyes were veiled by that native suspicion all desert folk held for strangers. Bitter lines tortured the edges of his mouth, where it could be seen through a fringe of white beard. He wore no steel suit, and it said much that he ignored this fact in the full knowledge of the moisture pouring from his house through the open door. Nice use of tortured, and Farak is immediately identified as wasteful. From somewhere behind the old man came the sound of a rebec wailing through the atonal dissonance of Semuta music. The old man's manner carried no drug dullness, an indication that Semuta was the weakness of another. It seemed strange to Sighthill, though, to find that sophisticated vice in this place. It is telling of Sighthill that he shows similar arrogance as the Sardaukar in the first book. The Sardaukar captured by Paul had first thought of Fremen Cave as a barbarian warren, until Paul announced himself as Duke Atreides. I find it ridiculously elitist to try to define one vice as more sophisticated than another. The houses all around had been built for veterans of the Jason. They formed a suburb of Arrakeen, which stretched into the Imperial Basin past Tiamat. This makes me feel that Paul has delivered on whatever promises were made to anyone who enlisted. Taking care of its veterans is one thing a government can do for its military. It is manifestly and understandably not enough to compensate for the horrors of war, which would be disillusioning to many. The adjoining house, he knew, had been assigned to Othame, once a member of Muad'Dib's dreaded Fedaykin death commandos, and Bijaz, the catalyst dwarf, waited with Othame. In my first read-through, I was distracted by remembering Othame that I didn't make a note of the catalyst dwarf Bijaz. He's important, and Herbert is fond of heavy-handed foreshadowing. That's not a strong critique, I like foreshadowing, and when I'm heavy with it, I have a specific purpose for it. I have a hard time justifying this one, though. Not like this, Sighthill agreed, realizing now what had brought Farak into the conspiracy. The Fremen longed for the old days and the old ways. It does make me wonder what effect Farak expects of Paul's death. Does he think that society will revert when freed from the agent of its change? I don't think that's how it usually works. Farak struggled with an intense dislike for his visitor, Sighthill realized. Fremen distrusted eyes that were not the total blue of the Ibad. Off-worlders, Fremen said, had unfocused eyes which saw things they were not supposed to see. This feels contradictory to me because Paul's eyes have become all blue, but it hasn't changed him. There should be a modifier in the statement that one had to be born with the blue eyes. Farak led him away from the youth, and under the arches of the opposite side, indicated cushions scattered over the tile floor. The tile was worked into designs of sea creatures. I think it's fantastic symbolism that there are sea creatures depicted on Arrakis. And here it also seems to be a sign of Farak's high opinion of himself, that he is like one of those creatures. My son lost his eyes in the conquest of Naraj, Farak said. He was nursed there and should have stayed. No woman of the people will have him thus. An atomic power device called a stone burner made him physically lose his eyes. It is said here not to be against the great convention of the Landsraad, because it skirts the line of being a weapon, and a stone burner sounds to me like an excavation device. I find it curious, though, to know I have grandchildren on Naraj that I may never see. This line made me awfully uncomfortable, enough that I debated whether to mention it here. It gave me an insight that I had resisted when reading the first book. Sometimes my brain successfully protects me from harmful thoughts. I resisted it because I have a deep affection for the story and I don't want it to be compromised. I expressed in episode 1 that I doubted that the Jason would be a surefire way to mingle gene pools, which is a crucial premise for the whole story. But I also left it at that. Now that I was made to think about it more, the way that a conquering force mingles gene pools with the people they are conquering is rarely consensual. Consensual mingling happens when there is more or less peaceful coexistence. Historically, sometimes when the non-consensual kind happens, the afflicted women and their offspring have been cared for by their people, but in other cases they were punished for something outside their power. If we assume that this is what Herbert meant, the text doesn't give approval for this any more than it disapproved of the Baron Harkonnen, but to present it as instinctual of humankind or natural says something, and it makes me extremely uncomfortable. Paul never explicitly disapproves of it, or I wouldn't have gone the whole book without having the thought. It is perhaps lumped in under the heading that war on a whole is horrific and should be avoided, but it's not a given part of a war either. It would have been problematic in of itself if Paul had assumed that the Fremen would engage in that behavior. But the Sardaukar explicitly did it when Shaddam occupied Arrakeen, and Paul thought that was good because it galvanized the city people of Arrakis against them. In the end, I'm confused, and Herbert's vagueness is frustrating. He might be getting away with things he shouldn't. I would love to be wrong about this, so please tell me if you have an alternative explanation. In this book, it is revealed that one effect of Paul's reign is a new, massive migratory behavior in the extended pilgrimage to Arrakis, but Paul couldn't see past the Jason in the first book, so I don't know if I buy that. A new Hajj is far from a granted effect of even a holy war. So yeah, I'm going to take a little break and come back refreshed. There are more uncomfortable things in this chapter. I offered to buy Tleilaxo eyes for him from your masters, Farak said, but there's a story in the Legions that Tleilaxo eyes enslave their users. My son told me that such eyes are metal and he is flesh, that such a union must be sinful. It's another interesting technology of this society. However, it does make me think that the Tleilaxo are pervasive enough that it's unlikely that they weren't even brought up in the first book. It also shows that the Fremen are immensely more familiar with the universe since the 12 years that's passed. In the last book, they were naive enough not to know that other cultures would consider it disrespectful to render a body for its water. He uses men to carry his distrans messages, Farak said. It demeans men to implant wave translators in them. A man's voice should be his own to command. It should not carry another man's message hidden within its sounds. Their respect for a person's sovereignty is deeply rooted in this culture, as we have seen, and the Tleilaxo are named amoral. Any kind of technological implant should be rejected, I think. But it is also very human to push a line when it's convenient, such as when you have lost your sight or you need to deceive your enemies. How do the Fremen cohorts feel now about Muad'Dib's jihad? Saitel asked. Do they object to making a god out of their emperor? This shows the fundamental disconnect between Paul and everyone else, and it's an effect of his secrecy. He kept any hint of a war to himself, while he was still aiming to stop it from happening. If he had made his opinion known, he could not as easily have been attributed with starting it. Most of them don't even consider this, Farak said. They think of the way I thought of it, most of them. It is a source of strange experiences, adventure, wealth. This Graben hovel in which I live, Farak gestured at the courtyard. It cost 60 lidas of spice, 90 kontars. There was a time when I could not even imagine such riches. He shook his head. Thinking of anything as an adventure does strip it of its realities. Did Farak, for example, know whence came his measure for this weight of spice? Did he ever think to himself that 1.5 kontar once limited a camel load? Not likely. Farak might never even have heard of a camel or of the golden age of Earth. I find it very interesting that mankind's existence on Earth is called a golden age. It raises questions about why and what happened to put an end to it. And thinking is to oneself by default. His words, oddly in rhythm with the melody of his son's balisette, Farak said, I owned a crysknife, water wings to 10 liters, my own lance, which had been my father's, a coffee service, a bottle made of red glass older than any memory in my siege. I had my own share of our spice, but no money. I was rich and did not know it. 2 wives I had, one plain and dear to me, the other stupid and obstinate, but with the form and face of an angel. I was a Fremen Naib, a rider of worms, master of the Leviathan and of the sand. I was a hint confused, because as far as I remember, Farak was just a member of the troop that found Paul under the leadership of Stilgar. But I guess a Naib is a less specific leadership term. The glossary says it is someone who has sworn never to be taken by the enemy, a traditional oath of leadership. I knew many things without the need to think about them, Farak said. I knew there was water far beneath our sand, held there in bondage by the little makers. I knew that my ancestors sacrificed virgins to Shai Hulud before Liat Kynes made us stop. It was wrong of us to stop. I had seen the jewels in the mouth of a worm. My soul had 4 gates, and I knew them all. And here is the other uncomfortable thing. You can probably guess why. I'm not an expert. So I'm fully open to the possibility that I'm completely wrong here. But I have always had an interest in ancient history, like mythology and things like that. So I've perked up whenever I've heard anything about it. I've watched documentaries and read some books specifically on ancient Greece. I'm quite convinced that human sacrifice has been extremely rare in human history. And though I can't name any sources, I have the impression that when it happened, it usually wasn't of individuals considered to be full citizens, rather of a slave class or captured enemies and the like. An arbitrary line was drawn between people thought to be of lesser worth. Whenever it was documented, I feel, it was sensationalized for obvious reasons. And I feel like it was much more common to make propagandist claims that a foreign culture conducted it as a justification to conquer them, to civilize the barbarians. This feels even more applicable because the Fremen sacrificed virgins. It doesn't make any sense to me that the oh-so-practical Fremen would do this, killing young people in the prime of contributing to the tribe. And it was put an end to by Liat Kynes, who was seen to have a dual citizenship of a kind. And this is presented as fact by both Shani and Farak, and there is no outrage to be seen anywhere. There's no mention whether the virgins in question are willing participants or forced into it. In other words, white savior shenanigans. And I don't like it because it makes no sense to me. The Atreides came, Farak agreed. The one we named Usul in our siege, his private name among us, Ar-Muad'Dib Ar-Mahdi. And when he called for the Jason, I was one of those who asked, why should I go to fight there? I have no relatives there. But other men went, young men, friends, companions of my childhood. When they returned, they spoke of wizardry, of the power in this Atreides savior. He fought our enemy, the Harkonnen. The Kynes, who had promised us a paradise upon our planet, blessed him. It was said that this Atreides came to change our world and our universe, that he was the man to make the golden flower blossom in the night. I don't know whether Farak believes that Paul is, some kind of a fraud, presenting himself as a Lisan al-Gaib for some ulterior motive, or whether he believes that the Fremen were wrong to expect such a person to exist. The mother of chaos was born in a sea, Farak said. A Kisara Tafwid stood nearby when I came dripping from that water. He had not entered the sea. He stood on the sand. It was wet sand, with some of my men who shared his fear. He watched me with eyes that knew I had learned something which was denied to him. I had become a sea creature and I frightened him. The sea healed me of the Jason, and I think he saw this. I like the emphasis on water as a creative force for good and evil, and I do accept that it would be interesting for a Fremen to come across so much water which is poisonous, with salt in this case. It makes me think about how water is deadly to the sandworms, so maybe Farak draws some likeness there. The musician's silence bothered him. Did it mean Farak's son was through transmitting? That had been the way of it naturally. The message condensed and transmitted within the music. It had been impressed upon Sightale's own neural system, there to be triggered at the proper moment by the distrans embedded in his adrenal cortex. If it was ended, he had become a container of unknown words. He was a vessel sloshing with data. Every cell of the conspiracy here on Arrakis, every name, every contact phrase, all the vital information. This is a good show of the distrans technology, here presented as a benign thing, as Sightale doesn't feel threatened by it. With this information, they could brave Arrakis, capture a sandworm, begin the culture of melange somewhere beyond Muad'Dib's writ. They could break the monopoly as they broke Muad'Dib. Nice use of writ, and nice to establish a cause worthy of all of this. The monopoly is Paul's power over the universe, so challenging it justifies any resource invested by the opposition. The youth took up his rebec, drew the bow across it. Semuta music wailed from the string. As though drawn by the sound, a young woman in a blue robe emerged from a doorway behind the musician. Narcotic dullness filled her eyes, which were of the total blue of the Ibad. Othaim's daughter, Farak said. My son gave her the narcotic in the hope of winning a woman of the people for himself despite his blindness. As you can see, his victory is empty. Semuta has taken what he had hoped to gain. As I said, piece of absolute filth. The son brainwashed a woman because he doesn't measure up to societal standards. And kidnapping this woman is Sightale's primary reason to be there, and so he kills both Farak and his son. I'm unsure what I feel about this strategy. The Tleilaxu are presented as devilishly cunning, but their scheming is completely undermined, eventually. Sightale sighed. It had been done with sympathy, he told himself, and the victims certainly had known their peril. Now the young woman would have to be given her chance. It is interesting that the BT excused their behavior by thinking that there had been an alternative, while Paul justifies his actions by thinking that the outcome is inevitable because the alternative is unacceptable. Chapter 5, which reveals the most about Paul's government. He is a dictator, and the exchanges between his highest council shows much. The members are Alia, whom I'm very interested in to see as a character, Irulan, who is a pawn of the Bene Gesserit, Stilgar, who does what he's told, Cheney, and Korba the panegyrist, who represents the religious cult around Paul, who we know wants to make a martyr out of him to make the cult permanent. We see Korba thrilled by the religious power he wields in Paul's name. Alia, on the other hand, is skeptic of Paul as a religious figure because she has insight into his prescience, and nobody likes Irulan, apparently. On the agenda is a power struggle with the Spacing Guild about maintaining an undisclosed location on the planet Tupile as neutral sanctuary for defeated great houses, which Paul yields to rather than pressuring the guild by withholding spies from them. Another conquered planet, Ix, wants political restrictions on the extent of Paul's dictatorial power. Also, Irulan's imprisoned father on Seleucus Secundus are performing landing drills with his remaining Sardaukar, which is obviously not to be allowed. And Irulan obviously wants to protect her father, which Paul actually allows. The Bene Gesserit formally requests that Paul impregnate Irulan, and Paul is again angered that Cheney supports it for the reasons of providing an heir. Paul formally rejects the proposal, in quite the dickish way. Finally, the guild wants to establish a formal embassy with a navigator ambassador. It would be opposed by the Fremen leadership, remembering the stranglehold the guild used to have on them, both in bringing their previous oppressors to Arrakis and demanding spice bribes not to let anyone monitor the surface. Paul's annoyed responses on the topic confirms to Irulan that Paul's prescience is blind to navigators, setting her firmer into the conspiracy with both resentment and security. It was going to be a bad session, this meeting of the Imperial Council, Alia realized. She sensed contention gathering force, storing up energy. The way Irulan refused to look at Cheney, Stilgar's nervous shuffling of papers, the scowls Paul directed at Corba the Kisara. This shows that, as opposed to how it used to be within House Atreides, the leadership of Paul's government are contentious with one another. Corba's cheeks went almost the color of his orange robe. He glared at Alia, an angry gnome, bald and fuming. Alia is one of my favorite characters. She has more personality than Paul, who is limited with his complete focus on the future. Corba pursed his lips in injured silence. Nice use of injured silence. Paul looked at his sister, wondering why she provoked Corba. Abruptly he saw that Alia had passed into womanhood, beautiful with the first blazing innocence of youth. He found himself surprised that he hadn't noticed it until this moment. She was 15, almost 16, a reverend mother without motherhood, virgin priestess, object of fearful veneration for the superstitious masses, Alia of the Knife. A nice summary of Alia as she is now, acknowledging how she came to be that way. Cheney, hands tightly clasped in her lap, glanced across the table at Stilgar, her uncle, Paul's Minister of State. Did the old Fremen Naib ever long for the simpler life of his desert siege, she wondered. Stilgar's black hair, she noted, had begun to gray at the edges, but his eyes beneath heavy brows remained far-seeing. It was the eagle stare of the wild, and his beard still carried the cat-tube indentation of a life in a stillsuit. Another great description of a character we got to know so well in the previous book, and also giving a sense that he has changed. Corba raised outstretched arms for the benediction, and a trick of the afternoon sun cast a red halo onto the window behind him. For a moment, Stilgar saw the court Kisara as a figure crucified on a fiery wheel. Corba lowered his arms, destroyed the illusion, but Stilgar remained shaken by it. His thoughts went in angry frustration to the fawning supplicants waiting in the audience hall, and to the hateful pomp which surrounded Muad'Dib's throne. I really like that Stilgar is given internal complications. It was a really sad line in the first book when Paul noticed him becoming a believer, a worshipper, but Stilgar here is shown to be different from the kind of believer as Corba shows himself to be. Paul's gaze followed the Kisara. Corba took his seat at Paul's left, dark features composed, eyes glazed by fanaticism. He'd enjoyed that moment of religious power. This makes it easy to understand how Paul's priesthood is a threat to him. Sensing his thoughts on her, Alia smiled at Paul. His expression softened. How could anyone react to Corba with other than cynical humor, he asked himself. What is more ridiculous than a death commando transformed into a priest? The Fedaykin's only function used to be to preserve the Lisan al-Gaib for the Fremen people, but now not so much. They have been freed from their oppressors, and Paul has given them the power to protect themselves. We tread with caution, Paul said. Tupile remains the place of sanctuary for defeated great houses. It symbolizes a last resort, a final place of safety for all our subjects. Exposing the sanctuary makes it vulnerable. I'm really interested in Tupile. In the first book, Leto named it offhand as an example as the most expensive place to live, as an example as the immense value of a handful of spice. But this guild-managed sanctuary didn't come up. It wasn't an alternative for Leto, in case he would have rejected the Emperor's appointment as the steward of Arrakis. He would have been forced to flee the known universe then. I can only imagine that Tupile becomes relevant in future books. If it doesn't, this is rather wasted space. She feels it too, Paul thought. Strange, what a sense of compelling responsibility they both felt for that brawling, idolatrous universe with its ecstasies of tranquility and wild motion. Must we protect them from themselves, he wondered. They play with nothingness every moment. Empty lives, empty words. They ask too much of me. Well, Paul is determined to remain a dictator, so it feels quite fair that he is responsible for the welfare of the universe. So it's not too unreasonable. His throat felt tight and full. How many moments would he lose? What sons? What dreams? Was it worth the price his vision had revealed? But it is tragic for him as a character, since he still feels compelled to do whatever he does. He looked at Alia, found her attention on Irulan. Alia sensed his movement, glanced at him, nodded toward Irulan. Ah yes, any answer they gave would find its way into one of Irulan's special reports to the Bene Gesserit. They never gave up seeking an answer to their Kwisatz Haderach. I do like the interplay between Alia and Paul, though it is telling that Paul only listens that way to someone who has comparable power and training to his own. Paul smiled. The issue of the oracle, by Stilgar's judgment, had been closed. Stilgar aimed only at victory, not at discovering truth. Peace, justice, and a sound coinage. These anchored Stilgar's universe. He wanted something visible and real, a signature on a treaty. Paul does seem liable to go off on more philosophical tangents in his governorship, so Stilgar's practicality, like Chani's, is probably good for him. Irulan, who had closed her eyes and put both hands to her forehead in mnemonic impressment, opened her eyes, studied Paul intently. Nice use of mnemonic impressment. Thus the Jason falters, Paul thought, but not soon enough to save me. The thought produced emotional tensions. He remembered his earliest visions of the Jason to be the terror and revulsion he'd experienced. Now, of course, he knew visions of greater terrors. He had lived with the real violence. He had seen his Fremen, charged with mystical strength, sweep all before them in the religious war. The Jason gained a new perspective. It was finite, of course, a brief spasm when measured against eternity, but beyond lay horrors to overshadow anything in the past. Having finished the book, I don't know if it's served by these cryptic allusions to an even worse fate than the Jason, at the same time as we are shown just how horrific it was, how horrific it still is. It was even more horrific to the forces that drove it, the impassioned soldiers with their ultimate dissolution. The alternative we are given eventually is Saki for Paul and Chani, but not for most of the populated universe, at least not in this book. If you're going to make grandiose claims as an author, then you need to deliver something, but maybe we'll learn of it in other books. Constitutions become the ultimate tyranny, Paul said. Their organized power on such a scale as to be overwhelming. The Constitution is social power mobilized, and it has no conscience. It can crush the highest and the lowest, removing all dignity and individuality. It has an unstable balance point and no limitations. I, however, have limitations. In my desire to provide an ultimate protection for my people, I forbid a constitution, ordering council this date, etc., etc. I acutely feel my lack of expertise in political science, but I'm pretty sure that the limitations of an absolute constitution are obvious, and that's why they can be subject to amendments. Irulan found something of interest in the palm of her left hand. A pulse throbbed at her neck. Irulan, Paul asked, do you persist in arguing that your father's one legion is nothing more than a toy? If you've been the supreme ruler of the universe once, and you believe you've been unjustly deposed, then retirement would be difficult to swallow. Paul shook his head sharply. They couldn't know that this was part of the price he had not yet decided to pay. This implies that Paul knows what Irulan is doing to Chani, and I wonder why she imagines that Paul doesn't know, when she until the end of this chapter doubted the conspiracies shielded from his prescience. Science and superstition all have failed her, Paul thought. Do I fail her too, by not telling her what bearing an heir to House Atreides will precipitate? He looked up to find an expression of pity in Alia's eyes. The idea of pity from his sister repelled him. Had she too seen that terrifying future? It's an obvious yes, that he is failing Chani by not telling her why she hasn't conceived another child. Obviously, she would blame herself for it, enough that she is advocating for Irulan's position. My lord must know the dangers to his realm when he has no heir, Irulan said, using her Bene Gesserit powers of voice with an oily persuasiveness. And Irulan is obviously desperate for it. Paul pushed himself away from the table, strode to the balcony windows. A wind was flattening the smoke of the city's fires out there. The sky presented a darkening silver blue, softened by the evening fall of dust from the shield wall. A very nice description of the view. The council sat silently waiting behind him, aware of how close to rage he was. I expressed in the previous video my disapproval of this reaction toward a leader. People did walk softly when the Duke was in a rage. You can't make a better argument for democracy than when people are afraid to express their opinions to a dictator. They reminded Paul that his reception hall would be packed with supplicants by now. Pilgrims. Their exercise in homelessness had become a disgusting source of wealth for his imperium. The Hajj filled the spaceways with religious tramps. They came and they came and they came. This made me really uncomfortable as well. Since the narrator is neutral, the only way to express sentiment is through the characters. The last book explained that it was important to Fremen culture that they had at some point been unwillingly relocated to a new planet, which cut them off from performing the Hajj. This is immensely disrespectful coming from Paul, the protagonist. It might be because he is skeptical of himself as a religious icon, but it doesn't feel like it. What was it the pilgrims really sought? Paul wondered. They said they came to a holy place, but they must know the universe contained no Eden source, no two-pile for the soul. They called Arrakis the place of the unknown where all mysteries were explained. This was a link between their universe and the next, and the frightening thing was that they appeared to go away satisfied. It is interesting that Paul is cut off from the religious experience despite being in its center. He felt that some element of himself lay immersed in frosty, hoar darkness without end. His prescient power had hampered with the image of the universe held by all mankind. He had shaken the safe cosmos and replaced security with his Jason. He had outfought and outthought and outpredicted the universe of men, but a certainty failed him that this universe still eluded him. One feeling I had reading this book, which differs from the last, is that Paul seems to believe that there is something akin to intelligent force that resists his powers. In the first, destiny seemed to me like subject to mentat computed probabilities. It's nothing concrete, but it feels to me like Paul feels there is a higher intelligence, which would be comparable to God. I know the political arguments, Paul said. It's the human arguments which concern me. I think if the princess consort were not bound by the commands of the Bene Gesserit, if she did not seek this out of desires for personal power, my reaction might be very different. As matters stand, though, I reject this proposal. I think that phrasing it this way is incredibly cruel to Irulan. Paul says that if she wanted a child out of affection, he might change his mind. It is a kind of cruelty to tell someone that they could have what they want, if not for something about themselves which they cannot change. Irulan is trapped as a pawn of the Bene Gesserit, and it does feel like her hand is forced. I'm not saying that her actions against Chani are in any way excusable, but it makes me think about one of the chapter intros in Dune, where Irulan commends Jessica's strength to go against the Bene Gesserit instruction for her to have a daughter. But back then, it was put against Irulan's mother's coherence with the instructions not to give birth to a royal heir, but now it feels like Irulan includes herself, her inability to stand against her orders. And it's even more cruel because of the condition that Paul might have gone along with it if she loved him. What a dick move! Why the hell would Irulan have any positive feelings about him at all? Chapter 6, in which the Gola of Duncan, Idaho is presented to Paul by Edric as a gift to thank him for allowing the guild the embassy. Alia is hiding, spying on the ceremony of their arrival at Paul's behest and giving commentary, recognizes hate as dangerous as well. The navigator, Edric, is confirmed as a very slimy character, no surprise there. Paul accepts the gifts because he did love Duncan, Idaho, something I didn't pick up on in the first book. The affection for Gurney Halleck was stated, but not for Idaho, I'm just saying. Like Gaia's Helen Mahayam worried, Hate does tell Paul the truth, that he is most likely a trap for Paul and should be sent away to be safe. One limitation of Agola is that they don't remember their previous lives, but Hate is obviously concerned for Paul in a way reminiscent of Duncan. Hate's search for his identity is central for his character, very explicitly so. Also, Gaius Helen Mohayem was seized on the transport that brought the envoy to Arrakis, and she has been detained by Paul. The sharply silver light of noon poured through clerestory windows onto a floor worked in green, blue, and eggshell tiles to simulate a bayou with water plants and, here and there, a splash of exotic color to indicate bird or animal. Clerestory was a new word for me. According to Merriam-Webster, it means an outside wall of a room or building, as a church, carried above an adjoining roof and pierced with windows which admit light to the interior. I would have a hard time understanding this definition without this accompanying picture. Sibling empathy told her that Paul seized with the same agitation she was experiencing, although she doubted another could detect it. Paul is upset because he sees Hate for the first time, not having predicted his existence. Captive memories absorbed in the womb during the moments of her mother's spice change identified this man for Alia by Riani decipherment, which cut through all camouflage. Paul was seeing him, she knew, out of countless personal experiences, out of gratitudes and youthful sharing. A nice reminder that Alia has all the memories of her mother, along with the previous Fremen Reverend Mother. And according to the wiki, Riani decipherment means that a Bene Gesserit can, without fail, identify a face dancer, which undercuts a whole lot of tension, I feel. The Gola walked with the cock-footed alertness of a master swordsman. Nice use of cock-footed alertness. In the Bene Gesserit way she could not escape, Alia read Paul's disquiet. He no longer looked at the figure out of his past. Not looking, his whole being stared. I do like that Paul can be gripped by emotion despite his abilities. It would be easy to imagine a prophetic character becoming apathetic to the present. The steersman assumed a sybaritic reclining pose in his orange gas, popped a melange capsule into his mouth before meeting Paul's gaze. The tiny transducer orbiting a corner of the guildsman's tank reproduced a coughing sound, then the rasping, uninvolved voice. I abase myself before my emperor and beg leave to present my credentials and offer a small gift. Such a douche, through and through. I do wonder if there ever will be a sympathetic guild character in this series. Also, nice use of sybaritic. The man called Hate stood impassively, metal eyes fixed straight ahead, body relaxed. No sign escaped him to indicate he knew himself to be the object of discussion. It is interesting that Hate is first introduced to us as an item. He is literally a gift, and then the books proceeds to establish him as a character. This is a Tleilaxu thing, Paul thought. There's the problem. The Bene Tleilax held little attachment to phenomenal nature. Good and evil carried strange meanings in their philosophy. What might they have incorporated in Idaho's flesh, out of design or whim? I'm guessing this is where the amoral part comes in. To do something just because you can is often presented as something selfishly reckless. In her dark spy hole, Alia trembled. It was Idaho's voice, a quality of sound so precise she sensed its imprint upon her cells. This enforced my worry that Alia would fall head over heels in love with Hate, which would make her a less interesting character, but this doesn't happen. Agola. This flesh was full of false impressions, easily misread. Old associations would persist. Duncan, Idaho. It wasn't so much a mask the Gola wore as it was a loose concealing garment of personality which moved in a way different from whatever the Tleilaxu had hidden there. Even though Hate is presented by Edric as a weapon of the conspiracy, it is the BT who are in ultimate control of what he does. She sensed the hidden perils in this gift then. This was a Tleilaxu thing. The Tleilaxu displayed a disturbing lack of inhibitions in what they created. Unbridled curiosity might guide their actions. They boasted they could make anything from the proper human raw material, devils or saints. They sold killer mentats. They produced a killer medic, overcoming the Suk inhibitions against the taking of human life to do it. Need I say how this undermines the first book? Overcoming the Suk conditioning was one of the key accomplishments of Vladimir, but apparently it was far from unique. Their wares included willing menials, pliant sex toys for any whim, soldiers, generals, philosophers, even an occasional moralist. Nice use of moralist being the odd one out in the products of the BT. I've done it now, Paul thought. I've accepted the Gola. The Tleilaxu creation was bait, no doubt of it. Very likely the old hag of a reverend mother played the same role. But it was the time of the tarot, which he'd forecast in an early vision. The damnable tarot. It muddied the waters of time until the prescient strained to detect moments but an hour off. Many a fish took the bait and escaped, he reminded himself, and the tarot worked for him as well as against him. What he could not see, others might not detect as well. I don't remember that early vision, if it was ever mentioned in the first book. I'm slightly confused that the tarot is blamed for muddling his abilities. I don't know much about it, but as far as I understand it, the tarot is a tool of forecasting, not the source of the power. In my mind, it's all of the practitioners of the tarot that are problematic. That might be a nitpick, but it still bothers me. The statement's candor shook Paul. But then, how else could a Sensuni mentat respond? Even in a Gola, a mentat could speak no less than the truth, especially out of Sensuni inner calm. This was a human computer, mind and nervous system fitted to the task, relegated long ago to hated mechanical devices. To condition him also as a Sensuni meant the double ration of honesty, unless the Tleilaxu had built something even more odd into his flesh. Hate knows and relays that he's meant to be a tool of Paul's destruction, despite his innate service to the Atreides. One theme of the book is that knowing the truth doesn't mean that you can change anything. It does contrast against Leto's attitude in the first book. He knew that the rule of Arrakis was a trap, and thought that awareness of the trap would allow him to escape. Why, for example, the mechanical eyes? Tleilaxu boasted their metal eyes improved on the original. Strange, then, that more Tleilaxu didn't wear them out of choice. True. It seems even the BT trusts more in the biological. It makes you wonder why they equipped Hate with an obvious physical reminder that he isn't Idaho. Send me away, sire, Hate said, and it was Duncan Idaho's voice full of concern for the young master. Paul felt trapped by that voice. He couldn't send that voice away, even when it came from a Gola. You will stay, he said, and we'll both exercise caution. It is endearing whenever Paul shows emotional weakness to something, because he can so rarely afford it. Where was Idaho in this shape-to-measure flesh? It wasn't flesh, it was shroud in fleshly shape. Idaho lay dead forever on the floor of an Arrakeen cavern. His ghost stared out of metal eyes. Two beings stood side by side in this revenant flesh. One was a threat with its force and nature hidden behind unique veils. Nice use of revenant flesh and fleshly shape. Why has no vision shown me this new Duncan Idaho, he asked himself. What concealed time from an oracle? Other oracles, obviously. And it wasn't Edric that hid the creation of Duncan Idaho, so we should be on the lookout for other possible responsible oracles. Old visions surged around Paul. Would he have to choose the terrible way? Distorted time hinted at this Gola in that hideous future. Would that way close in upon him no matter what he did? I'm not sure that I can take seriously Paul being so torn on whether his fate is fixed or not. There's a double uncertainty. We don't know what it is, or if it can be avoided. I spent most of the book waiting for the next clue, and it didn't come until the very end. and even then it was quite underwhelming. Disengage, 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 the thought told in his mind. Nice use of told, as in the tolling of a bell. A magnetic attraction about this hate reached up to her. Tleilax's restoration had given him youth, an innocent intensity which called out to her. She'd understood Paul's unspoken plea. When oracles failed, one turned to real spies and physical powers. She wondered, though, at her own eagerness to accept this challenge. She felt a positive desire to be near this new man, perhaps to touch him. He's a danger to both of us, she thought. I like this confirmation of Alia's understanding of the situation. It doesn't disarm hate as a danger to her, but it would be too naive of Alia not to recognize the danger. Chapter 7. I really like this chapter as well. Gaius Helen Mahayam is imprisoned, and naturally Irulan goes to her. The Reverend Mother delivers fresh, silent instructions to Irulan. It summons the knowledge that Jessica used to be in Irulan's place as Mahayam's servant and chose to disobey. You've sent word to the Lady Jessica, the Reverend Mother asked. Yes, but I don't expect her to lift one finger against her firstborn, Irulan said. Well, Jessica adhered to the Bene Gesserit agenda for a very long time when she had reason not to, so who knows? She had yet to assimilate the import of the actions which had precipitated her into the cell. Dark suspicions brooded in her mind, and the tarot hinted at confirmations. Was it possible the guild had planned this? Nice use of precipitated, and nice illustration on how little trust there is within the conspiracy. In that moment, she suspected guild perfidy, or exposure through some transcendent power of the emperor or his sister. Perhaps the steersman did not conceal the conspiracy after all. The abomination, Alia, certainly possessed the abilities of a Bene Gesserit Reverend Mother. What happened when those powers were coupled with the forces which worked in her brother? Nice use of perfidy, and I like all the ways that Alia is differentiated from Paul, even though they have similar abilities. Say no more, the Kisara ordered. The thing is ordained. That was how they always spoke of imperial commands, she knew. Ordained! The holy ruler whose eyes could pierce the future had spoken. What must be, must be. He had seen it, had he not? It's a very handy tool of a dictator, one must admit. With the sick feeling that she was caught in a web of her own spinning, she had turned to obey. This feels somewhat like Jessica wanting to disavow responsibility for how Paul turned out, which is because it didn't turn out the way they wanted. The Reverend Mother sighed. On the surface, it was a sigh of a prisoner bemoaning her fate, but inwardly she felt the response as a comment on Irulan. It was futile to hope the Atreides Emperor's precious gene pattern could be preserved through this instrument. No matter her beauty, this princess was flawed. Under the veneer of sexual attraction lived a whining shrew, more interested in words than actions. I laughed out loud at this part. It is so harsh. The narrator may be neutral, but there is still judgment delivered. Because of the foreword by Frank Herbert and Frank listening enough to his audience to resurrect Idaho, a small part of me thinks that it's possible that some of his audience was like me, sympathetic to Irulan against Frank's wishes, so he set about her total character assassination. Very effectively. It's only a small part of me who thinks that, because I also thought that this set Irulan in the position of underdog, maybe hinting at a possible redemption arc. The one that comes out irredeemable is the Reverend Mother. Irulan was still a Bene Gesserit, though, and the Sisterhood reserved certain techniques to use on some of its weaker vessels as insurance that vital instructions would be carried out. Yeah, she's either underdog or tragic human weapon, either of which evokes sympathy. Beneath small talk about a softer palate, better food, the Reverend Mother brought up her arsenal of persuasion and gave her orders. The brother-sister crossbreeding must be explored. Irulan almost broke at receiving this command. Yeah, it is well known that the Bene Gesserit are for incest when it suits their genetic breeding programs. The members are kept ignorant of their heritage for that end. It's still abhorrent, but within that policy exists a level of mercy in that what they don't know won't hurt them. With Paul and Alia, they would obviously be fully cognizant, and thus Mohiam is irredeemable. Irulan only protests because one thing to bring about this crossbreeding might be the death of Cheney, and Irulan knows that she would be the first suspect if something happened to Cheney. In the effort to get pregnant, Cheney has gone on a special diet, so Irulan can no longer poison her food. And the effect is that she is now highly likely to conceive. Mohiam orders Irulan to cause Cheney to have a miscarriage in such a case, because an heir to the throne would even further undermine the Bene Gesserit's standing. Irulan argues that such an act would be tantamount to the murder of Cheney, and understands that she has lost all usefulness to the Bene Gesserit, that hate is now a more important weapon against Paul. It was a rebuke with a subtle message, Irulan realized. The Bene Gesserit whip that instructs informed her that she should have understood long ago that this similarity between the spice and the gola melange was valuable, but it exacted a price, addiction. It added years to a life, decades for some, but it was still just another way to die. Fair, I guess, but it doesn't really hold water. There are equivalents to draw which invalidates it, like anyone with a chronic illness who takes medication for it. The Reverend Mother's eyes, dark with the blue brilliance of her melange addiction, stared up at Irulan, measuring, waiting, observing minutiae. This does mean more now, like the spice is killing her already, even though it doesn't really work. She reads me clearly, Irulan thought with dismay. She trained me and observed me in that training. She knows I realize what decision has been taken here. She only observes now to see how I will take this knowledge. Well, I will take it as a Bene Gesserit and a princess. This is obviously the point Scytale predicted when she must stand on her own. As a Bene Gesserit, she should do as she's told, to kill Janey and precipitate a liaison between Paul and Alia. As a princess, she shouldn't give up until she is the mother of the next heir to the throne. Neither of those things are okay. When calmness had returned, she thought, let them spend me. I will show them what a princess is worth. Perhaps I'll buy them more than they expected. Underdog. She turned away from the cards, sat in agitation, wondering if Irulan might yet destroy them. Redemption. Chapter 8, in which we gain insights into Alia. She performs a religious role directly interacting with worshippers and pilgrims. She hates doing it, but it is required to maintain the religious pretense around Paul's rule. She is frustrated, and because of cues given by the text, this comes across as sexual frustration, which could be relieved by hate. The creepiest part about her premature awakening is the implication of receiving sexual knowledge before she was even born, which is so creepy that it's not even addressed before now, and not in its problematic aspect. To ward off her frustration, she first tries to have a bath, and when that fails, she tries to spend her energy in very dangerous combat training. Paul and Stilgar arrives because whatever Irulan chose to do indirectly told Paul that the guild will attempt to steal a sandworm to take to another planet, something that could not be accomplished without Fremen aid to avoid patrols and whatnot. Vendors moved among the pilgrims, and there were minor sorcerers, haruspices, diviners, all working their trade in pitiful imitation of Paul Muad'Dib and his sister. Commerce and opportunism will infiltrate anywhere where there's profits to be had. Also nice use of haruspices. Red and green packages containing the new Dune tarot were prominent among the vendors' wares Alia saw. She wondered about the tarot. Who was feeding this device into the Arakeen market? Why had the tarot sprung to prominence at this particular time and place? Was it to muddy time? Spice addiction always conveyed some sensitivity to prediction. Fremen were notoriously fey. Was it an accident that so many of them dabbled in portents and omens here and now? She decided to seek an answer at the first opportunity. I still don't have a grasp of the role of the tarot, and it's not explained. And Alia doesn't get that answer. There was a wind from the southeast, a small leftover wind blunted by the scarp of the shield wall, which loomed high in these northern reaches. The rim glowed orange through a thin dust haze, underlighted by the late afternoon sun. Nice use of leftover wind and blunted. Also nice use of underlighted. One did not jostle a wild Fremen, even in a mob such as the ones which swarmed to Alia's fane. There were no knifings in the sacred precincts, but bodies had been found later. This also does not feel appropriate to the Fremen. To stalk someone and kill them because they bumped into you is just petty, and I don't buy it. I also love the word fane. The departing swarm had stirred up dust. The flinty odor came to Alia's nostrils, ignited another pang of longing for the open blood. Her sense of the past, she realized, had been sharpened by the coming of the Gola. Nice use of flinty. He was near, she knew, that shadow figure of a man she could sense in her future, but could not see. It angered her that no power of prescience could put flesh on that figure. He could be sensed only at unexpected moments while she scanned the lives of others, or she came upon a smoky outline in solitary darkness when innocence lay coupled with desire. He stood just beyond an unfixed horizon, and she felt that if she strained her talents to an unexpected intensity, she might see him. He was there, a constant assault on her awareness, fierce, dangerous, immoral. The immoral part gives an idea that it might be Paul, but I never bought into that risk. Brian said that the audience was disappointed by Paul, but that would be so many steps too far. I like that Alia is distracted by wondering about her own future, as anyone would be. To see just a hint of someone she knows will be crucial to her life would be more frustrating than seeing nothing at all. Moist, warm air surrounded her in the tub. Here was a habit she had learned from the memory entities of the uncounted Reverend Mothers who were strung out in her awareness like pearls on a glowing necklace. A lovely simile, also showing how far back she remembers Reverend Mother's lives. It must be before they came to Arrakis, where there is no such thing as baths. The chamber, oblong and skylighted, contained the gross and subtle instruments which toned a Bene Gesserit adept into ultimate physical and mental awareness / preparedness. I really like that there are instruments the Bene Gesserit use, but as much as I dislike seeing a parenthesis in fiction, a / is abhorrent. It's a personal opinion, but it looks so bad to me. She slipped the crysknife from its sheath at her neck, held it sinister, tapped the activating stud with the sword tip. She is initiating practice with an automated dummy, which goes up in difficulty every time you score a point against it, raising it several degrees too dangerous for even the best swordsman. She goes until interrupted by Paul and Stilgar, Paul disarming it with a throw of a knife that would be impossible to anyone else. He had himself tried to fight a dummy on a too high setting once upon a time. The use of sinister here reminded me that it's another word for left-handed, which makes me remember that I gave props to the use of attack sinister in my previous video, which looking back obviously also meant left-handed. I still think it's really good, regardless. We're here at Irulan's suggestion, Paul said, as strange as that may seem. She believes, and information in Still's possession appears to confirm it, that our enemies are about to make a major try for. It is very frustrating that we don't get to see that scene with Irulan after the build-up with Mahayim, but it's fine, I guess. My lord, Stilgar said, his voice sharper. As her brother turned, questioning, Alia continued to look at the old Fremen Naib. Something about him now made her intensely aware that he was one of the primitives. Stilgar believed in a supernatural world very near to him. It spoke to him in a simple pagan tongue, dispelling all doubts. The natural universe in which he stood was fierce, unstoppable, and it lacked the common morality of the Imperium. Calling someone a primitive is never good, is it? And it emphasized the cynicism of both Paul and Alia to humor this religiosity they don't believe in. And Stilgar is here overcome by the fact that Alia is of sexual maturity and thus needs to be properly tied to a man, or there'll be trouble. That brainless automaton loomed in his mind with all the aspects of an ancient horror creature. Its possession was the shibboleth of this age, but it carried also the taint of old immorality. Once they'd been guided by an artificial intelligence, computer brains. The Butlerian Jason had ended that, but it hadn't ended the aura of aristocratic vice which enclosed such things. I had to look up shibboleth, which means a lot of things. Here I believe the definition best suited is a custom or usage regarded as a criterion for distinguishing members of one group, such as a social class, from those of another, which is a great word. I also like the aura of aristocratic vice. Alia turned around, focused on Paul. Knowing how his mind worked, she realized she'd been the subject of a mentat decision, uncounted bits falling together in that human-computer analysis. There was an inexorable quality to this realization, a movement like the movement of planets. It carried something of the order of the universe in it, inevitable and terrifying. This seems like Alia is afflicted by some of what the true believers think about anything Paul orders to be, like it's inevitable because it comes from him. But he is also there because he wants Alia's advice. Aware that she dared not try to match logic with her brother, Alia put the past few moments aside, Bene Gesserit fashion, said, "Irulan sent you." She found herself experiencing menace in that thought. "Indirectly," Paul said. "The information she gives us confirms our suspicion that the guild is about to try for a sandworm." Again, I would have liked to see that interaction. Stilgar opened his mouth, closed it without speaking. He had the overwhelming sensation that his idols had admitted blasphemous weakness. This goes to show how little Paul trusts his confidence. Stilgar didn't before know that Paul's visions doesn't reach others with prescient abilities. "We prevent nothing forever," Alia said. She didn't like the feel of the way Stilgar's mind was working now. He had narrowed his scope, eliminated obvious essentials. This was not the Stilgar she remembered. I take this to mean that Stilgar had come to rely on Paul's infallibility, and learning otherwise starts him in other thought patterns. "Damnation!" Paul exploded. Alia studied Stilgar, sensing the savage sideshow of ideas taking place in his mind. He was hung on a rack of enchantment. Magic, magic. To glimpse the future was to steal terrifying fire from a secret flame. It held the attraction of ultimate peril, souls ventured and lost. One brought back from the formless, dangerous distances something with form and power. But Stilgar was beginning to sense other forces, perhaps greater powers beyond that unknown horizon. His queen, witch, and sorcerer friend betrayed dangerous weaknesses. It's a good development, I think, reinvigorating Stilgar to a more interesting character than a blind follower. Chapter 9. Which is my least favorite chapter, literally speaking, because it contains one quite unfortunate part. It begins with a most hostile exchange with Edric to the displeasure of Stilgar. Edric openly provokes Paul, questioning the legitimacy of his role and religious position. It doesn't bite very deep, since Edric has been made out to be the least threatening part of the conspiracy. Sighthill being present in the guise of a servant also makes it feel less important. He would intervene if Edric was saying something potentially detrimental to their plans, resulting in a quite uninteresting exchange. We also learn that the palace has been infiltrated by a disguised Sardaukar, and Paul orders them to be executed. I find it telling that Shaddam IV was not included in the conspiracy against Paul, more or less denoting him as irrelevant. I wonder if he or Count Fenring ever comes back as active characters. The steersmen appear to be fighting a losing battle to contain his nervous energies. Gone were the languid fish motions of their earlier encounter. Edric's tiny eyes jerked here, there, questing and measuring. Navigators are apparently uncomfortable in small rooms because they are accustomed to the vastness of space. It doesn't seem to mean much. Sightail, Edric had called him. Sightail, an aide. The aide's surface shouted stupidity, but the eyes betrayed him. They laughed at everything they saw. It says plenty about Sightail that he seems to take the conspiracy as a game. It's all right still, Paul repeated, and he gave the private hand signal which made the order an imperative. Nice use of imperative. You twist my words, sire, Edric protested. An odd sense of violence lay suspended in the words. Nice use of suspended. Edric's shrug stirred the orange gas around his head. He no longer appeared concerned by Stilgar, although the Fremen continued to glare at him. I don't feel like I have a grasp on Edric's character. He is primarily unlikable. Paul felt himself go inwardly still, a profound caution gripping him. To whom was Edric speaking? Damnable clever words, heavy with manipulation leverages. That undertone of comfortable humor, the unspoken air of shared secrets. His manner said he and Paul were two sophisticates, men of the wider universe who understood things not granted common folk. With a feeling of shock, Paul realized that he had not been the main target for all this rhetoric. This affliction visited upon the court had been speaking for the benefit of others, speaking to Stilgar, to the household guards, perhaps even to the hulking aide. This makes it slightly more interesting, but it's not really explored. It's a very long-term plan to try to turn Paul's closest against him, and I never got the hint the conspiracy involved that degree. Some say, Sightail said, that people cling to imperial leadership because space is infinite. They feel lonely without a unifying symbol. For a lonely people, the emperor is a definite place. They can turn toward him and say, "See, there he is. He makes us one." Perhaps religion serves the same purpose, my lord. This sentiment was echoed on the wiki when I clicked around for the other video, and I guess it is one explanation for how a sprawling universe was brought under the rule of a single individual. Paul stared at the shambling figure of Sightail, wondering at the man's words. A peculiar fellow, that Sightail, he thought. While he was speaking, he had radiated a feeling of many people, as though his entire genetic inheritance lay exposed on his skin. So Paul definitely knows that he's a face dancer. That's one level of tension removed from the conspiracy. How could he protect himself from himself? They certainly were setting him up to destroy himself, but this was a position hemmed in by even more terrifying possibilities. I was getting a hint frustrated at the consistent hints at this terrifying possibility. It's already well established that Paul has that concern. If we're not going to get more information, it's needless to keep repeating it. Also, nice use of hemmed. Earth, Golden Age, Stilgar was irritated and puzzled. Why would Paul wish to discuss myths from the dawn of time? Stilgar's mind still felt crammed with Sabulon data, computations from the staff mentats, 205 attack frigates with 30 legions, support battalions, pacification cadres, Kiseret missionaries, the food requirements, he had the figures right here in his mind, and melange, weaponry, uniforms, medals, urns for the ashes of the dead, the number of specialists, men to produce raw materials of propaganda, clerks, accountants, spies, and spies upon the spies. I like this because it shows that the Jason isn't something that's vaguely going on against Paul's actual wishes. He is actively approving every expense for it. And it's a fair point to make that leaders are ultimately responsible for the actions of their military. But Paul is about to compare his vicarious kill count to that of Genghis Khan and Hitler. And I know that Herbert isn't always the most subtle, to put it mildly, but this is like making the point with a club. And I so much preferred it when the Earth ancestry was delivered in small clues. The distance between now and the future becomes so much smaller, even though Stilgar refers to it as the dawn of man. If you can pick names out of history, it wasn't that long ago. You control your legions, sire, Stilgar interrupted, and it was obvious from the tone of his voice that he suddenly felt his own position in that chain of command, his own hand guiding all that power. Nice that his Nuremberg defense is falling apart. In the abrupt stillness of the moment, Stilgar edged himself into a position where he could study Paul's face. It was deftly done. Paul admired the way of it, an achievement devoid of any forwardness. It was a Fremen thing, slyness touched by respect for another's privacy, a movement of necessity. I think the evolution of Stilgar's character has the potential to be the best part of the book, but that depends on what happens in coming books. Chapter 10. Alia and Hate are in the desert because a scout found parts of the remains of Othain's daughter, but so little of them that they can't tell who she was, only that she was a Fremen and addicted to Semuta, which is rare. The interesting part is a discussion which involves Hate's character, and he is the one leading Alia onto the thought that the dead body might belong to a Fremen woman who has been replaced by a face dancer. This chapter made me really appreciate Hate, but it's difficult for me to summarize why, because a lot of what he says is formulated in philosophy. It does show that he is profoundly occupied by a wish to access his inaccessible memories, so much so that he is afraid to discover that he is in fact not Duncan Idaho, but a random creation of the BT. He reveals to Alia that he and Paul speaks frankly about the risk Paul poses to his own rule, which reminds of Saitel's prediction that he will destroy himself. Alia is profoundly frustrated by Hate, at the same time as she is engaged, because few are bold enough to ever tell her the truth, which makes sense with her being a religious icon. In the end, Hate steals a kiss from her, with the questionable excuse that he could tell that she wanted it. It's not phrased in a questionable way, but one becomes sensitive to this excuse. And he does say she should be thankful he didn't do all the things she wanted. I'm giving the benefit of the doubt that Herbert didn't mean it like it sounds in this day and age. A wheat-colored sky enfolded the scene in the glaucous light common to mid-afternoon for these latitudes. Nice use of glaucous, which can mean a pale yellow-green color, or a light bluish-gray, or bluish-white, or having a powdery or waxy coating that gives a frosted appearance and tends to rub off. All of those are great. Alia felt that she had accomplished nothing here except to cast her own aura of mystery about a scene that was already mysterious enough. Alia's frustration with her position is amply examined in this chapter, and I very much appreciate it. The mortuary attendants waited patiently. This corpse contained not enough water for them to salvage. They felt no need to hurry, and they'd believe that Alia, through some glyptic art, was reading a strange truth in these remains. Nice use of glyptic, which means the art or process of carving or engraving, especially on gems. There was only a distant feeling of anger deep within her at the obvious thoughts in the attendants' minds. It was a product of the damned religious mystery. She and her brother could not be people. They had to be something more. The Bene Gesserit had seen to that by manipulating Atreides' ancestry. Their mother had contributed to it by thrusting them onto the path of witchery, and Paul perpetuated the difference. I am biased against Jessica, and now because of Mahayim against the Bene Gesserit, so I appreciate that Alia realizes, and also Paul being committed to being an effect of those forces. Aren't you curious about such memories? Of course, Curiosity urges me forward, but I move against a heavy reluctance. I think, what if I'm not the one they believe me to be? I don't like that thought. That is the dangerous part about hope, that it might not be realized. She saw suddenly how strong must be this need to know who he'd been. It was a central compulsion with him. Yeah, yes, we got that already. Subtlety. And she saw his right hand lift, fall, almost the old salute of Caladan. A pensive look came over his face. So Herbert can be subtle. He just intermingles it with the bleeding obvious. Alia found herself stilled by Fremen awe. He gave water to the dead. Compulsively, she touched a finger to his cheek, felt the tear. I do like that Alia is portrayed as Fremen in essence, which makes sense considering not only that she's lived as a Fremen, but the preponderance of Fremen memories of those she inherited. I dare much more than my makers anticipated, he said. Because of that rare fact, I remain with your brother. I was curious to see how this assumption would play out, realizing eventually that it doesn't. Both of you were taught to govern, he said. You were conditioned to an overweening thirst for power. You were imbued with a shrewd grasp of politics and a deep understanding for the uses of war and ritual. Natural law? What natural law? That myth haunts human history. Haunts. It's a ghost. It's insubstantial, unreal. Is your Jason a natural law? Nice use of overweening, but I feel that plenty of natural law is proposed in these books, especially the first one, where humankind is described as a coherent organism. The inclinations of such a unit would be precisely like natural law in my mind, and according to that interpretation, yes, the Jason is in accordance with it. That is not to say that I believe such a thing exists, and if it does, whether it should be respected, but I don't know how else to interpret it. She whirled away from him, realizing in the instant of action what this betrayed about her own feelings. Without wile of voice or witch-wrought trickery, he had reached into her psyche once more. How did he do this? It must be something for her to feel like a singular person rather than Saint Alia of the Knife. It was a gentle kiss, brief. He pulled away, and she stared at him with a shock leavened by glimpses of spasmodic grins on the faces of her guardsmen, still standing at orderly attention outside. Nice use of spasmodic grins. Alia put a finger to her lips. There had been such a sense of familiarity about that kiss. His lips had been flesh of a future she'd seen in some prescient byway. Breast heaving, she said, I should have you flayed. Which was thankfully obvious. Also nice use of prescient byway. There's a young woman dead out there, he said. Perhaps no young woman is reported missing among the Fremen. Mentats continue to be useful tools. And that's the final chapter for today. I'm still not sure if this is the best place to break, but it is just about in the middle of my script. And I guess there's a bit of a cliffhanger. Not really. We get that this is because Scythiel has replaced Othing's daughter. I do feel there is a loose thread if you think about the bodies of Farak and his son. Like, who cleaned up that mess? They must have done a better job than whoever failed to completely dispose of this corpse. And I'm torn on the BT. This is a really good chapter, but I would like them to be more scrupulous than this. This feels like a very big mistake, at the very least showing an overconfidence which undermines the tension of the book for me. Anyway, what did you think about any part of this video? Please let me know down below. Do you like it more to get a break until the next video like this? Would you like to see some dedicated random vocabulary appreciation in some form? My training list really is hundreds of pages long, so I'm sure I would be able to do something with that. It's made up of both words I don't know and a whole bunch of words I do know and wish would come naturally to me. If you liked watching, please leave a like, and share it with your friends if that's the kind of thing you do, and subscribe for the next episode of Good Lines Micro Appreciation when we will finalize Dune Messiah. Have a great day. Have the best day. Bye. I'm not sure if this video is any better than the previous one, but I'm going to keep going, and someday we'll reach the point when there's a noticeable quality difference. My hair is slightly different. I got a new straightening thingamajig, which makes it easy to put this little bend at the top tips, which I'm very excited about, and I'm sure you don't care. So I'll end this now. Thank you so much for watching. Bye for real now.